Lan Kwai Fong, just a short street, only a few dozen meters long. On a normal night, it's full of laughter, drinks, bright lights. A place where many people in Hong Kong come to relax, to party, to celebrate. But in the early hours of January 1st, 1993, this street turned into hell. That night was New Year's Eve. Tens of thousands of people crowded into Lan Kwai Fong for the countdown. The place was packed, shoulder to shoulder. The street is sloped, and in the chaos, someone tripped, people pushed forward, others lost balance, and soon one body piled on top of another. In the end, 21 people were crushed to death and more than 60 others were seriously injured. The government called it an accident, but some people say maybe something else was calling them back there. And the truly strange part, it wasn't just what happened that night. It's what started to happen after. From that moment on, strange things began to appear in the narrow streets of Lan Kwai Fong. Things that couldn't be explained. The first story about Lan Kwai Fong I ever heard came while I was working at a TV station. It was told to me by other staff, because the person at the center of it was actually one of our colleagues. Let's call him Paul. On December 31st, 1992 New Year's Eve, Paul had made plans to have dinner with his wife in Kowloon to celebrate. You should know, Kowloon and Lan Kwai Fong are not close. They're separated by the harbor. That night, Paul and his wife had arranged to meet at a hotel restaurant in Kowloon at 8 p.m. But his wife never showed up. Back then, communication wasn't like today. No mobile phones. He had no way of reaching her. So Paul waited at the hotel, and waited. By 10 o'clock, the restaurant was about to close. He had no choice but to go home, hoping maybe she'd already returned. But she didn't come home. Not even by midnight. Then at 3 a.m., the phone rang. It was the hospital. They said his wife had been involved in an incident, and she was now being treated. They told him to come as soon as possible. Paul rushed to the hospital. Thankfully, his wife wasn't seriously hurt. She had just fainted, and had already regained consciousness. The nurse told him she was very lucky, because earlier that night, right at midnight, when the clock struck January 1st, 1993, there had been a crowd crush in Lan Kwai Fong. Many were injured, some died, but his wife had only passed out from shock. She was expected to be discharged the next day. But Paul couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. They had clearly arranged to meet in Kowloon. Why and how had his wife ended up in Lan Kwai Fong? He asked her. She just looked confused, shook her head slowly, and said she didn't know. She had no memory of how she got there. So Paul asked again, "Why did you go to Lan Kwai Fong?" His wife looked lost. Her voice was low, her eyes unfocused, staring at the ceiling of the hospital room. And then, slowly, she said, I don't know why I was there." Paul said, in that moment, a chill ran straight down his spine. Her voice wasn't like someone who had simply forgotten. It was like someone describing something that had happened to someone else. Detached, distant. Her eyes, he said, he had never seen her look like that before. Trying to explain it rationally. He even wondered, was there someone else? But even that didn't make sense. Who would arrange to meet their husband in one place, while meeting someone else in another, at the same time, on New Year's Eve? It just didn't add up. In the end, Paul couldn't make sense of it. But since his wife seemed unharmed, he chose to let it go. The next day, around 6 p.m., Paul planned to take his wife home. But the hospital said no, because at exactly 5 p.m., she suddenly developed a high fever. She had to stay for further observation. So on the third day, Paul decided to bring that friend with him to the hospital. He thought maybe having someone there would help. Maybe just for emotional support. But the moment his friend stepped into the room, he stopped. Paul's wife was lying there, pale and weak, her skin almost gray. She was still burning up. And without hesitation, his friend turned to Paul and said, "This isn't just a fever. I can feel something. There's a spirit following her." He looked Paul dead in the eye. "It's not a kind one, and it's not something medicine is going to fix." Every day, at exactly 5 p.m., she would get another high fever. Even after taking all the medication, nothing worked. The doctors had no explanation. Paul started to believe what his friend had said earlier. The hospital had already given her plenty of medicine. She had only fainted from shock, not from any illness. There was no reason for a fever that wouldn't go away after 3 straight days of treatment. But the strangest thing was about 1 or 2 hours before each fever, his wife would begin to change. She spoke less. Her eyes became empty. Sometimes she would stare at a corner of the hospital room for minutes. Other times, she mumbled to herself in a low voice, but Paul couldn't make out the words. One night, a nurse doing her rounds said she heard the wife talking in her sleep, but it wasn't Cantonese. It sounded like another language, harsh, raspy, and unnatural. There were even times she would suddenly slam the bed frame with her hand, loudly and without warning. Then, just as quickly, she'd fall back asleep like nothing happened. Paul said that every time he visited, he could feel something was wrong. There were moments, just seconds, where his wife's eyes looked like someone else was inside her. On the 4th morning, she suddenly woke up. Her mind was clear. She gave Paul an address and told him to visit a certain family. Then she said, "My daughter is dead." Paul was stunned. "What daughter? You don't have a daughter." But his wife insisted, for 3 days in a row, that Paul needed to go see that family, because their daughter was her. Paul was confused and disturbed. Eventually, he went to the address himself. To his shock, he really found the family, and they told him their daughter had been missing for a long time. She had never come home. Paul told all of this to his friend. The friend said, "This isn't something we can handle anymore. We need to call a master." So they brought in a Taoist master to the hospital. The master saw Paul's wife, didn't say much, just chanted some scriptures. Then he turned to Paul and said, "All I can do is pray for her. There's not much else I can do, because there are 8 spirits attached to her body, and they are not kind." The master said these spirits had come to collect a debt. He didn't know what she had owed them in her past life, but in this life, she had to repay it. Then he said something even more chilling. "She won't last much longer. A week, at most. Then they'll take her." Paul asked the doctors again, but they had no answer. Her symptoms didn't match any known illness. No infection, no cause. Just an unexplainable, repeating fever every day at the exact same time. On the 6th night, Paul went to visit her as usual. Surprisingly, she was awake and clear-minded. She even asked him, "Was work tiring today?" Paul was touched. It had been so long since they had a normal conversation. As he sat down, ready to reply, his wife suddenly looked at him and softly said, "In the next life, please don't come looking for me." Paul froze. He gave a nervous laugh and said, "What do you mean? Why would you say that?" She didn't answer. She turned over and quietly went back to sleep. That night, she didn't speak again. Before Paul left, he stood at the doorway of the room, looking at her, and deep in his heart, he had a terrible feeling that this would be the last time. The next morning, the hospital called. His wife had passed away. Later, the master said, those 8 spirits were probably already prepared. They had taken control of her body earlier, led her to Lan Kwai Fong that night. They were hoping to claim her during the stampede. Maybe, in a past life, she had owed too much, and in this one, there was no escaping the debt. There's a line from Buddhist scripture that says, "When you die, nothing follows you except your karma." Maybe that's what this was all about. Have one more story to tell about Lan Kwai Fong. Ever since the crowd crush incident, that little street has had a steady stream of strange, unexplainable events. This one was told to me by an actress, I'll call her Jenny. Around 10 years after the stampede, Jenny and one of her friends were often working late together. After work, they would frequently have dinner in Lan Kwai Fong. Almost every night, they ate at the same restaurant. But her friend had one very strange habit. She would never sit at the table in the back right corner of the restaurant. Even if the place was full and there were barely any seats left, she would rather wait than sit there. Jenny didn't mind. She wasn't picky about where to sit. Although she thought her friend's behavior was a bit odd, she didn't ask too many questions at first. This routine went on for a few months. Nearly every day, dinner at the same restaurant with the same friend. Then one evening, just before they ordered, Jenny couldn't help it anymore. She finally asked, "How come all this time? You've never once sat at that table?" Her friend didn't answer. Her face changed, just slightly. A little uneasy, but she still said nothing. Seeing that she didn't want to talk about it, Jenny didn't push. They went ahead with dinner as usual. After the meal, while they were getting ready to leave, her friend suddenly grabbed her by the hand. In a quiet voice, she asked, "Do you really want to know why?" Jenny was a bit startled, but nodded. Her friend glanced around the restaurant, then said, "It's not that I don't want to tell you. I just didn't want to say it inside the restaurant." Once they got outside, she finally began to explain. Her friend said she had been able to see spirits since she was a child, different kinds. And the reason she never sat at that corner table was because every time she walked into the restaurant, she would see two shadowy figures sitting there. She said those two figures had never left, no matter how many real customers sat at that table. Those two shadows were always there, still unmoving, never gone. The creepiest part, her friend said, was this. Every time she walked into the restaurant, those two shadowy figures would immediately look up and stare straight at her. Through the entire dinner, they never looked away. It didn't matter where she sat. Their eyes would follow her, locked on her the whole time. At first, the two figures just sat quietly, but whenever they saw her, their expressions would change. Hostile, aggressive, almost furious. Not like any other spirit she had ever seen before. She explained, most spirits, if you don't bother them, will act like you're not even there. They ignore you if you ignore them. But these two were different. They knew. They knew she could see them. And the part that chilled her the most was what happened that night when Jenny finally asked, "Why don't you ever sit at that table?" The moment Jenny said those words, her friend said the two figures stood up and walked straight toward Jenny. Then they just stayed there, stuck close to her. She said even she was frightened, because up till then, those spirits had only stared. But this time, they moved. And maybe it was because someone finally spoke about them. That's why, all this time, she never dared say anything. She was afraid that they would notice, or worse, that they already had. Some things in life don't make sense, but somehow they still happen. Lan Kwai Fong, once a place of laughter, drinks, and celebration, now, for some, has become a street they can't look back at. In the daytime, it looks normal, like nothing ever happened. But at night, something is still there. Do you believe it? Or don't believe it? It doesn't really matter. What matters is, next time you sit down for a drink in Lan Kwai Fong, take a quick look at the empty chair next to you. Are you really sitting there alone? Now, let's talk about some of the urban legends connected to the Lan Kwai Fong crowd crush incident. The first one is about a poster. A few days before the tragedy happened, a strange poster was seen hanging on one of the streets in Lan Kwai Fong. It showed a walnut, cracked open, and inside the shell were a pile of human heads. There were 21 heads in total. and later on, 21 people were confirmed dead in the crowd crush. The number was exactly the same. After the incident happened, the poster was quickly taken down and never seen again. Coincidence? Or something else? The second urban legend is even more disturbing. It's about a string of mysterious deaths connected to people who were involved in covering or handling the tragedy. The police commander in charge that night, 10 years later, he died after falling from a high floor in his own home. One of the TV reporters who had done live coverage of the event, she died 10 years later, also from falling inside her home. Another reporter who had covered the story died of cancer, 7 years after the incident. And one more, a female TV journalist. She died mysteriously in her apartment, 13 years after the event. Another fall. 3 stories point 3 chilling encounters. A mysterious poster that seemed to predict the exact number of deaths. A series of deaths that felt more like a curse than coincidence. And 2 silent figures in the corner of a restaurant, watching people with blank, unblinking faces. Each incident seemed unrelated on the surface. But somehow, they all pointed to the same place, Lan Kwai Fong. This place, once known for laughter, parties, music, and alcohol, in the eyes of some, slowly turned into something else. A street you wouldn't dare walk down alone at night. A name you might even be afraid to mention. The stampede back in 1993 took 21 lives. But many believe what truly stayed behind in Lan Kwai Fong wasn't just death. It was something much harder to explain. A lingering obsession that never ended. Those who never left might not want to. Or maybe, they simply can't. They still appear in familiar corners, watching you as you pass, or waiting for someone to finally say something about them. You might ask, these are just urban legends, right? What's there to be afraid of? But sometimes, what's scarier than believing is seeing something before you even believe. The ghost stories of Lan Kwai Fong don't end here. Next episode, we'll follow 2 more disturbing tales. One takes place inside a taxi. The other, inside a restaurant. Lan Kwai Fong is always like this. In the daytime, nothing seems strange. But at night, you start to hear things you were never meant to hear. If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell. Because next time, we'll tell you something even harder to explain.